This podcast includes discussion of rape and sexual assault, abuse, murder, and other criminal behavior. Listener discretion is advised. Doug Lovell sat under sentence of death at the Utah State Prison. His guilty plea to the murder of Joyce Yost and his failure to lead police to her body had resulted in the ultimate penalty. South Ogden Police Sergeant Terry Carpenter couldn't escape the thought, though. The whole mountain search during the summer of '93 had been an act of misdirection on Doug's part.
Dave, we tried everything that we could to try to get him to be truthful with us about where she was and what he used. And he definitely said he came back with the shovel the second time, but still then he indicates that she was only a few inches under the ground.
Joyce's daughter Kim Salazar and her husband Randy believed Doug had used Snow Basin as a ploy to enjoy a few days of relative freedom.
I don't believe she was there for one thing.
Doug hadn't offered a good explanation for why Joyce's body wasn't where he had claimed to have buried her, which opened the door to speculation.
The other thing that I've wondered in the back of my head is Doug was driving the cement truck. Could he have known that there was going to be a huge cement pour someplace and got Joyce tucked down into the foundation someplace and just covered her up with cement? I don't know.
He drove a cement truck, and I think he knew where cement was being poured. I think he put her there one day, and the next day he poured cement there.
I've heard several variations on this theory. Joyce might be under a road bridge that now spans the Ogden River, which was under construction in '85. Or maybe she's under the foundation of a house near where police found her car. These theories run the gamut from impossible to improbable because, remember, Doug had lost the cement truck job weeks before the murder, so he couldn't have been driving one himself. But there's one version of this theory that carries at least an air of plausibility. Let me explain. In the days following Doug's sentencing, Terry Carpenter received a tip from a woman who suggested Doug might have buried Joyce in concrete along Utah State Route 193. That's the highway that runs along the southern edge of Hill Air Force Base. The road, on which the cement plant where Doug worked, still sits today. The tip didn't go anywhere at the time in '93, and the woman who provided the tip is no longer alive, so I can't go ask her about it. But I recently spoke to the man who gave Doug the job driving the cement truck. He told me about a place where all the drivers used to dump their excess cement back in the day, a spot along State Route 193. It's a place Doug would have known about and had access to even after losing the job. What's more, it's a place midway between where he had left Joyce's car and where he had burned her clothes. Where, if he had left Joyce's body, it would have subsequently been covered over by layer upon layer of hardened concrete. Of course, for this theory to work, we would have to believe everything Doug supposedly told Rhonda the morning after the murder was complete fabrication.
He can look at you and lie to you with the best of liars you've ever met.
Whether Joyce was, or still is, buried on the mountain near Snow Basin, or entombed within tons of discarded ready-mix concrete, something else was about to be unearthed that would further cement Doug's guilt. This is Cold, Season 2, Episode 10, Buyer's Remorse. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. We'll be right back. The paperwork sentencing Doug to death wasn't filed with the court until August 18, 1993, 2 weeks after the sentencing hearing. A week after that, on August 25th, Doug wrote a letter to Judge Stanton Taylor asking to withdraw his guilty plea.
John talked me into going with you because he said he doubted that you would or could give me the death penalty. He was wrong.
John was defense attorney John Kane. Doug said he had instructed John to file a motion withdrawing the guilty plea, but had received no response.
I wanted all along to have a jury hear the penalty hearing and not you because I felt I had a much better chance with the jury to receive a life sentence.
On August 30th, John filed a formal appeal of the death verdict. He did so without consulting Doug. Communication between attorney and client had broken down, it seemed. So during a hearing on September 20th, Judge Taylor allowed Doug to fire John. But he didn't address Doug's request to withdraw the plea. That ended up in limbo. Meanwhile, Doug's appeal of his death sentence went to the Utah Supreme Court. The appeal raised 4 arguments, 3 of them claiming ineffective counsel on the part of John Kane. The most substantial of those said John had had a conflict of interest due to his friendship with former Weber County Attorney Reed Richards. Reed and John went way back. They had taught college law classes together. They had owned real estate together. They had even worked side by side as partners in their own law firm before Reed split off to take the county attorney gig in the mid-'80s. Reed was still serving as the county attorney in '92 when Terry Carpenter served Doug with the capital homicide charge.
This is all part of count 1. Says basically the same information on the top of a capital felony to it.
The Utah Supreme Court sent the appeal back to the trial court in January of '95 on what's known as a Rule 23B remand. This provision of the Utah Rules of Appellate Procedure allowed the higher court to have Judge Taylor dig into the conflict of interest claim to see if it had any merit. A few months later, Doug's new lawyers succeeded in convincing Judge Taylor to recuse himself from the case. And so, the matter ended up before a new judge, Michael Lyon. 2 full years of hearings and depositions followed. They resulted in a much clearer record of the backstory behind the plea negotiations in Doug's case, which you heard in the last episode. In March of '97, Judge Lyon wrote up his findings and sent them back to the Utah Supreme Court. These were stressful years for Kim and Randy Salazar.
Our friends would ask us to go out, and Kim she would not want to go out.
They both worked outside the home, raised their 3 children, and did their best to keep up with a never-ending barrage of court dates. Kim kept close tabs on the case, making sure her mother's interests were represented. The weight of that responsibility wore on her.
It changes how you are as a wife, as a mother. It just does things to you. It changes who you are. It's not right.
The desire to find her mother consumed Kim. She and her brother Greg Roberts figured Doug had little left to lose, and so they decided to approach Doug.
Just with the goal of finding the remains.
But how to do it? In the last episode, I told you about a letter Doug had written to the judge. Doug had said he hoped for an opportunity to speak with Joyce Yost's family.
It would be hard, but I think it would be good for them and me as well.
Kim and Greg decided to hold Doug to that. They went to the Utah State Prison for a face-to-face meeting with the man who had killed their mother.
I didn't believe that you could sit 3 feet from me and look me square in the eye and see my pain and lie to me, but it's totally possible when you're Doug Lovell. It's totally possible because he did it for over an hour.
Doug shed tears during this encounter. He talked of the Almighty, as he had in his letter to the judge.
Joyce has always been in my thoughts and prayers. I have never said a prayer that she wasn't a part of, and at each end asking God and her for forgiveness.
But he provided no good explanation why he had sexually assaulted Joyce.
I think Kim had some hopes that she was going to find some answers to why he did it, because she asked him that. But I think she left there tortured and worse off for it.
The reason why he had returned 4 months after the rape to take Joyce's life was obvious.
And that's why he did everything, because he had been in prison before. He didn't want to go back.
And yet, here he was, not only in prison, but on death row.
I had to shake his hand through the bars, and I just wish I'd have broken his arm. That's all I could think about from that day. And I know that nothing positive came out of it.
It was just one more trauma, piled atop all the others. Kim and her husband Randy had endured a great deal together, from the early days after Joyce's disappearance.
Kim was crying a lot, and she was depressed, which she had every right to be.
To the trial.
Randy said something to him, and he just turned around and he said, "She's gone now, buddy, she's gone."
To those hot summer days of the mountain search.
So we go up by Snow Basin.
They discovered they had grown apart over those many years. In February of '98, Kim filed for divorce.
I don't blame my divorce on this. Man, everybody has problems in their marriage, and our problem just went a little further. But you know what? It was some hard times. It was some real hard times.
A member of the Weber County CSI team received a call from South Ogden Police on a Saturday in July of '98. They needed her to respond to a vacant lot midway between Joyce Yost's old apartment and South Ogden Police headquarters. A group of people working to clear that lot ahead of a planned development had that morning dug up a sawed-off shotgun. The CSI tech went to the field and found the gun. The barrel, what was left of it, appeared badly rusted. The wooden forearm, the part you would pump to feed shells into the firing chamber, had started to decompose. She could see the wooden stock had also at some point been sawed off, effectively giving the weapon a pistol grip. The gun had been buried in a small pit near a tree, tucked back into bushes out of sight of the road. The CSI tech looked around and also spotted 14 unfired shotgun shells. They were 12-gauge Magnum, loaded with double-aught buckshot, the type of shell one might use to take down a trophy buck or moose. The CSI tech also found a glove. Moments later, one of the workers called her attention to a second glove nearby, the obvious mate of the one she had just found. She photographed these items, gathered them up, and took them to the crime lab. The gun didn't stay there long. The rust and deterioration had left it frozen, with a shell in the firing chamber unable to be ejected. The gun could still possibly fire, though it was anyone's guess as to when or how. South Ogden Police retrieved the gun from the crime lab a week later. They had pieced together its provenance.
They called me and said, "Guess what? We found your shotgun."
Terry Carpenter had retired from the South Ogden Police Department just months before this shotgun's discovery, concluding a 20-year career with the city. But he knew which shotgun they meant.
One of those guns was cut off and was going to be a sawed-off shotgun.
The Winchester, which Billy Jack had years earlier told Terry he had buried after deciding he couldn't kill Joyce Yost. The Utah Supreme Court held oral arguments on Doug's appeal a couple of months later, on September 1st, 1998. A lawyer for the Utah Attorney General's office pointed out Doug hadn't brought up his May '93 letter seeking to fire his lawyer, John Kane, at his June change of plea hearing or his August sentencing.
The state's now arguing that Lovell backed off. He acquiesced, he changed his mind, and decided, no, Kane's fine. I'm going to go through with the deal that he's negotiated for me.
The state lawyer said Doug had known what he was doing.
How do you respond to Mr. Brunker's point that this was a sophisticated and indeed historically somewhat manipulative defendant who was perfectly capable, upon his next appearance before the court, of reiterating those points if he still had any commitment to them?
Doug's lawyers argued Judge Taylor should have proactively asked about the letter and said failing to do so was enough to warrant a reversal of the conviction.
I'll take the case under advisement. We'll be in recess for 10 minutes before we hear the next matter.
Carl Jacobson's career at the Utah State Prison had continued to progress. He had promoted from lieutenant to captain in the 6 years since he had escorted Doug Lovell to maximum security in '92. The promotion had placed Carl in command over Uinta 1, Death Row. He supervised the staff who oversaw Doug. Carl's father died in December of '98, and he took a week off to grieve, to comfort his mother, and to attend to the funeral arrangements. He was surprised when he returned to work to find a card waiting in his office. He opened the envelope and found a message of sympathy from Doug Lovell. This wasn't an off-the-shelf Hallmark card. It was handcrafted. Carl wasn't sure what to think, but the card bothered him. He'd had a hand in denying Doug's request to attend his own mother's funeral in '91. As such, the card seemed to carry a degree of subtext. Carl sat on it for a few days. He knew a bit about Doug's crime, having read his file. But Carl hadn't talked to Doug himself about the case for 10 years, since they had both been in SSD. Doug as an inmate and Carl as a young corrections officer. Doug, at that time, had still been denying any knowledge of what had happened to Joyce Yost. Carl decided it was time they talk again. He told his staff to pull Doug out of his cell and place him in a conference room. He instructed them not to interrupt him for an hour. He intended to talk to Doug, man to man. Carl started out describing the experience of shopping for his father's casket. He talked about how, at the cemetery, he had seen deer and rabbits and felt a tremendous sense of peace. Carl then told Doug Joyce's family should have the same ability to visit her final resting place. Doug recited the story he had told at his sentencing. Carl didn't buy it. He said he believed Doug knew right where the body was. He believed Doug was being evasive, but couldn't understand why. After all, Doug had already received his death sentence. What more harm could the truth now bring? That, of course, depended on the outcome of Doug's appeal. The Utah Supreme Court issued its decision in April of '99. Associate Chief Justice Christine Durham authored the opinion. It dismissed the accusation John Kane had been compromised by a conflict of interest. Durham called the evidence in the case overwhelmingly conclusive, but said John Kane had still endeavored to secure the best possible plea deal. She noted Doug had himself torpedoed those efforts by confessing to the murder, but said even if he hadn't, he couldn't have won a lesser sentence. The gravity of that sentence was only underscored when, in October of '99, the Utah Department of Corrections executed a man named Joseph Mitchell Parsons by lethal injection.
At the stroke of midnight, witnesses say Joseph Parsons drew a few short breaths, his fingers twitched, then his mouth and hands turned blue.
Parsons had absconded from parole in Reno, Nevada in August of '87. While on the run, he had hitched a ride from a man named Richard Ernest near Barstow, California. Ernest had agreed to take Parsons as far as Denver, Colorado. They had gone about a third of the way when Ernest stopped at a rest area in southern Utah to sleep. Parsons would later claim Ernest repeatedly touched his thigh in a sexual manner, and he retaliated by pulling a knife and stabbing him to death. Parsons dumped Ernest's body along the freeway, then continued on using the dead man's car, credit card, and identity. A Utah Highway Patrol trooper caught up to him later that afternoon. Parsons had pleaded guilty to murder and opted to have a jury decide his sentence. The jury had chosen death.
Parsons' last words were love to my family and friends and to Woody. Then witnesses say he shouted, "The Rainbow Warrior rules."
Woody was Parsons' nickname for his prison friend, Doug Lovell. Prosecutors and prison staff were at first perplexed by his mention of a Rainbow Warrior.
I have no idea what it means. I don't care what it means.
Thinking it was a boast over having killed Ernest, whom Parsons believed was homosexual. The truth, as reported in an Associated Press article days later, was much more pedestrian. Parsons was a fan of race car driver Jeff Gordon, whose colorful stock car had earned him the nickname Rainbow Warrior. Parsons and Doug Lovell, the article said, often bet on the outcome of NASCAR races. Judge Michael Lyon signed a new death warrant for Doug in the months that followed Parsons' execution. Doug did not give up the fight. He obtained a new attorney and, in October of 2001, filed a renewed motion to withdraw his guilty plea. The prosecutors immediately countered, asking Judge Lyon to dismiss the motion. The two sides argued back and forth until in February of 2003, Judge Lyon made a decision. He said Doug couldn't withdraw his plea for a couple of reasons. First, he had made the request too late. State law said a guilty plea had to be withdrawn within 30 days. Doug's letter had come more than 60 days after he had pleaded guilty. Second, the judge said John Kane's filing of the appeal and the Utah Supreme Court's decision on it had taken the matter out of his hands. He no longer had jurisdiction. Doug appealed, and so his case returned to the Utah Supreme Court in September of 2004, 6 years to the day after its last visit.
Good morning. We're here in the matter of the state of Utah versus Lovell.
Yeah.
Lovell or Lovell? Lovell.
Doug had yet another round of new lawyers. They argued the 30-day clock to withdraw the guilty plea had actually started running on the date of Doug's sentencing in August of '93, not the day in June when he had entered the plea. They cited precedent. The Utah Supreme Court had decided in another case that the 30-day counter started running at the, quote, final judgment of conviction.
I would just ask this court to remand for a hearing on the merits and give Mr. Lovell the opportunity to have these issues heard.
In May of 2005, the Utah Supreme Court ruled Doug's original motion to withdraw his guilty plea was still pending. The High Court ordered Judge Lyon to decide if Doug could, in fact, take back his guilty plea. There is a place in the mountains east of Ogden called Sunridge Highlands. It's a plateau just east of the Powder Mountain Ski Resort. A place where people park camper trailers in the summer or spend crisp autumn days secluded in their cabins. Sunridge Highlands is not open to the public. It's a private mountain community and access is limited. Getting in requires a gate key. Dorothy Dial's son, Jeff Wyas, Joyce's nephew, though only about a year younger, visited Sunridge Highlands in 2004 with some relatives. While there, he spotted a for sale sign on one of the lots, and he decided to buy. Jeff called the number on the sign. A man named Russ answered. They negotiated the purchase. Jeff agreed to bring a certified check to Russ's house. When he did so, he realized the person from whom he had agreed to buy the lot was Russell Lovell, Doug's older brother. It was a crazy coincidence. Jeff completed the purchase without revealing his connection to Joyce Yost. Then he did some research and discovered Russell hadn't owned the lot himself. I have checked the property records too and confirmed it had belonged to Russ Lovell's mother-in-law. Jeff soon learned the cabin Doug's father had built in '79 was also in Sunridge Highlands, just a half-mile to the east of his new property. Jeff began to wonder if perhaps Joyce might be buried there. He wasn't alone.
That would be much more logical.
Bill Holthouse told me the searches for Joyce in '93 left him convinced her remains were nowhere near Snow Basin.
I was skeptical from the start that we were going to find anything up there because I have a personal belief that there's another location for that. But it would make sense to me that he would go to a familiar place. And he was at that cabin a lot when he was younger.
I've mentioned in earlier episodes that the access road for Sunridge Highlands splits off from the same highway that one would take to access Causey Reservoir. And you might remember that's the same area where Doug's ex-wife Rhonda told police in '91 that Doug had taken Joyce on the night of the murder.
And they went up by Causey.
This statement has for years left Joyce's children Kim Salazar and Greg Roberts pondering the possibilities.
I think everybody feels as though she's like somewhere up near Causey in that part of the world.
To my knowledge, the area surrounding the Lovell family cabin has never been formally searched.
They never pursued a warrant, and the father would never let them go there.
Terry Carpenter told me police did discuss the idea with Doug's dad, Monin, years ago.
His dad swears up and down that he did not go up onto the property at South, whatever that property's called. He says he didn't have my keys. He could have had those keys and made copies of them, and then his dad has his own keys back and never know that Doug's got his own keys.
Weber County records showed the 2-acre lot no longer belongs to Doug's family, but it is still private property. Greg told me a few years back he received a call from a Sunridge property owner who offered to take him up for a look around.
I called Terry Carpenter and said, would you guys still be willing to do something like that? He said, yeah, we would, and I've really never followed up on it.
It's probably a long shot in any case.
Well, that's so many years later, though. I mean, you'd have to professionally do that with ground-penetrating radar now to even have a chance.
Jeff Wehis, for his part, told me he spent years wandering and wondering before he at last sold his lot at Sunridge Highlands. In all that time, he never found any sign that Joyce was there. Doug Lovell's son Cody continued to grow while his father's appeals were working their way through the courts. He hadn't seen his dad much during the first few years after his mom had turned state's witness. Rhonda had stopped visiting her ex-husband, as you might imagine. But in July of '97, Doug had retained an attorney named Russell Manasse with the help of the ACLU and made a push for his parental rights. Manasse met Doug expecting to find a man who was angry at the world. But he wasn't. Manasse would later say Doug was warm, engaging, intelligent, and articulate. They became friends and together succeeded in convincing a judge to require Cody to visit Doug at the prison once a month. I mention this not to pry into the privacy of Cody's childhood, but because of what it tells us about Doug. Court records show Cody was escorted on those visits by someone he trusted, Terry Carpenter. The Joyce Yost investigation had more or less come to an end when Doug had received his death sentence, but Terry had remained close in the time since with Rhonda and her children.
I don't think you'll ever put something like this to bed, something that will always be there. You'll always have it there.
A few years later, Rhonda sought out an oral surgeon for Cody when it came time for him to have his wisdom teeth removed. She selected Joyce's son, Greg Roberts.
She brought their son to me to get his wisdom teeth out. I was really blown away by that.
Greg's dental practice in South Ogden was well established by that point.
I'm quite sure she knew who I was. But, I put him under anesthesia and she was right there. And I thought, she's got a lot of trust.
Neither of them acknowledged their shared past, what they had each lost. Cody had lost a great deal as well. He had never known his father outside of phone calls.
Hi, Dad.
Hi. What are you doing?
Playing Watson Bot.
Huh?
Watson Bot Simpson.
Are you?
When you want to bring me those presents?
Soon, Cody. Real soon, okay?
Okay.
And visits to the prison.
God, Rose, I miss him so much.
I know.
I think about him constantly. Boy, oh boy. I'd be with him, you know what?
Yep.
Someday, huh?
Uh-huh.
Someday had never come. I should note, I reached out to Cody and his sister Alicia, requesting interviews for this podcast, but received no response. Utah court records do show, when Cody turned 18, he had his last name, Lovell, legally changed. Judge Michael Lyon held a hearing in November of 2005 to address the question sent back to him by the Utah Supreme Court. Should Doug Lovell be allowed to withdraw his guilty plea? Doug, his father, Terry Carpenter, and John Kane all testified. The most interesting part of this hearing, though, was who didn't testify. Doug had pushed his attorneys to call Rhonda. He wanted to point out how John Kane had refused to ask her certain questions during the '93 sentencing hearing. Doug's attorneys, James Redelick and Ryan Bushell, told the judge they were not keen on this strategy. They figured it would do more harm than good. Doug had insisted, though, so they did try to put Rhonda on the stand. Judge Lyon refused to allow it. Doug sent a letter to his attorney a couple of weeks later.
For you and Ryan to say that her testimony is irrelevant and possibly detrimental to my case is absolutely absurd. There is nothing Rhonda could say that would hurt my case any more than what I have already admitted to.
He called Rhonda a willing participant in Joyce's murder and rejected the claim she had only gone along out of fear.
Had John asked Rhonda the questions I wanted him to ask her back then, Judge Taylor would have seen Rhonda's true and full involvement in everything and would never have said her involvement was peripheral. It could have been the very thing that tipped the scale in favor of not giving me the death penalty.
Doug took his complaint straight to the judge in another letter a couple of weeks later.
Dear Honorable Judge Lyon, this letter is to inform you that I am requesting this court to reconsider Rhonda Butters having to testify.
Judge Lyon held a hearing on this request the following April. It didn't go well for Doug. The judge called the issue, quote, categorically irrelevant. That August, the prosecution and defense presented a fresh round of legal arguments in the fight over the guilty plea. Doug's attorneys said the judge who had sentenced him in '93, Stanton Taylor, had failed to strictly follow what's known as Rule 11. The rule deals with what a judge is supposed to explain to a defendant who makes a guilty plea. Judge Lyon once again denied Doug's motion to withdraw his guilty plea on October 5, 2006. He shot down the Rule 11 complaint, saying the transcript showed Judge Taylor had adequately advised Doug of his rights. However, Rule 11 had changed about a month before the '93 sentencing hearing, and Judge Lyon said Judge Taylor had used the outdated version. As a result, Taylor had failed to specifically mention the right to the presumption of innocence, the right to compel the attendance of defense witnesses, and the right to a speedy jury trial. Doug's defense team seized on this and filed a third appeal to the Utah Supreme Court. A man named Jared Briggs arrived at the Utah State Prison in the fall of 2006. He started out as most male inmates did in Uinta 5. That was the prison's R&O facility, registration and orientation. Due to overcrowding, staff soon moved Jared to Uinta 3, which housed R&O overflow. What he saw there sickened him. Mildew in the showers, blood on the walls. Jared went to work cleaning it without being asked. The guards took notice and soon offered him a job over in Uinta 1, death row. Jared's crimes were not the type to warrant living on death row. He'd been involved in theft and fraud. Although the job would mean living in the death row unit, he wouldn't be subjected to the same sorts of restrictions as the other inmates there. And to his benefit, he would get out of R&O, in which his freedoms were few, much more quickly. Jared accepted the job and moved into Uinta 1, cell number 104. He was surprised when, on his second day there, an older guy with a mustache came by his cell and offered him a cup of coffee.
When he offered me the coffee, I threw it away because I didn't know these guys from Adam. I didn't know if they was trying to kill me or, I just don't know. I didn't eat anything they ever gave me.
That's Jared's voice from an interview with investigators recorded at the prison. I'm going to warn you to take everything he says with a heavy dose of skepticism. He himself explained why.
My word probably isn't worth a whole lot on the outside. I'm going to be right honest with you. I had a gift gave to me, I guess, from God, and I can talk a nun out of her panties, and, I use that.
That's a good one.
The second voice there belongs to Shane Miner, who was then working as an investigator for the Weber County Attorney's Office. Jared's job required that he deliver food trays to the other cells. He soon learned that the man with the mustache lived directly above him in cell 110. His name was Doug Lovell.
He liked hunting and fishing. I liked hunting and fishing. So that's where we first connected. His dad had a farm. My dad has a farm. So we started talking a little about that.
Soon, Jared was stopping by Doug's cell on his own time. Doug reciprocated, coming down to talk to Jared during the few precious hours he spent outside of his cell.
So what happens is Doug's cuff port, where we stick the trays, is open. So how I talk to Doug is I sit on a bucket in front of his cell, and then when he talks to me, he's down in my cell doing the exact same thing.
Something about this fast friendship made Jared uneasy. Whenever he talked about his family, he took care to not give too much away.
I gave him a fake address for my parents and a fake name for my girl because prison's a tough deal to tell everybody all your business. And so he was telling me some stuff, my dad lives here, got a cabin here, da-da-da-da-da. I said, my family lives in Idaho, Rexburg area, gave him a fake address, and you know what I mean.
Jared told Doug about his health problems. He had had cancer, but embellished the details and described it as terminal. This only seemed to further earn Doug's trust.
One day he says, hey, I want to tell you about my case. So that if it changed your opinion of me, I know that.
Jared put Doug off. He talked about his own cases instead, but Doug persisted.
He come down to my cell and he says, hey, tonight I want to tell you about my case.
Jared said Doug proceeded to describe the events of 1985, starting with his rape of Joyce Yost. But the version Jared recounted here diverged from the one we have already heard from Joyce herself.
But he was going down the street, and Joyce pulled up alongside of him at a stoplight. He was looking over at her, and she looked at him, and kind of gave him the looks, what he called it, and he pulled him behind her and followed her to her house.
Jared had some of the details right and others wrong. He knew the make and model of Doug's car, a Mazda RX-7, but said it was yellow instead of red. Jared said Doug claimed to have simply snapped when he grabbed Joyce and put her in his car. Here again, Jared made claims not supported by known facts. He said Doug had bound Joyce's hands, something she never described. Yet he knew exactly how many buttons Doug had torn from the front of Joyce's dress.
And then he looked at me and says, hey, I hope you don't treat me any different because of what I did.
Jared said Doug had bailed out of jail after convincing his family and his wife Rhonda that he hadn't raped anyone.
Him and Rhonda drove by, and Joyce was out on the front lawn mowing in a bikini. And Rhonda says to Doug, hey, if I got sexually assaulted, I wouldn't be out on the front lawn with a bikini on mowing my lawn. I don't think you did this. So Doug went, they made this plan. Rhonda says, you just kill her. You just get rid of her. Then we ain't going to have a trial. You ain't going to go to prison,
If Jared's words were an accurate representation of what Doug said, a big if, then it would seem Doug's intention was to implicate Rhonda.
He did tell me, he goes, Rhonda's a key witness. He says they don't have anything but Rhonda. And he says, if she was gone, then I guarantee I'd get out.
The conversation continued over the course of several days. Jared kept handwritten notes as Doug described Joyce's murder. This was in line with what Doug himself had described from the witness stand during his sentencing 13 years earlier. So too was Jared's depiction of Doug stripping the bloody bedsheets, flipping the mattress, and driving Joyce's car up Ogden Canyon to the Snow Basin Road.
I'm not real familiar with the road, but I've got a map here of what he drew me, but...
He drew you a map?
Yeah.
Again, that other voice belongs to investigator Shane Miner.
It's pretty hard for me to tell you all this next part. It's
just take your time. Just take your time.
Jared said Doug pulled off the road next to a guardrail, where he again sexually assaulted Joyce. Afterward, Doug walked her up into a patch of trees.
When she got up there, he turned her towards him and says, you're going to pay for this. And he grabbed her around the mouth, the nose, and had a hold of her. And he said she just fainted, went to the ground.
Jared said Doug claimed to have walked back to her car, where he paused to wonder if Joyce might regain consciousness.
So he turned around and went back. And she was laying with her head on the ground. And he grabbed her hair and pulled her head back with the knife, went around her throat. And he told me that he pretty near cut it all the way off, he said.
This was decidedly different from what Doug had testified to in '93. Doug, Jared said, had visited his dad a couple of days after the murder.
His dad was working on the lathe, and his dad had one of those plastic things on his head for the shavings to hit, guard. And him and Doug was talking, and Monin said, Doug, how is your case going with Joyce? And Doug said to him that he goes, she ain't going to be showing up for trial. And his dad took that shield and lifted up and looked at Doug. And then just turned back and went to work. And Doug told me that, he says, I think my dad knew what I had done, but he never said anything.
Jared said Doug had worried a hunter might find the body.
He kept telling Rhonda, I've got to go do something with that body. And she says, Doug, the cops are following us. And he says, well, I'm still going to go do it. So he drove up to where Joyce is at. And then he says he went to start digging, and there was tree roots, and it was just real hard. He dug a little bit, and it was just too hard to dig.
Here's where Jared's tale really turned interesting. He said Doug had claimed to have put Joyce's body in a plastic bag, placed the bag in his car, and then driven to Causey Reservoir. There, at a spot along the reservoir's north arm, he had tied a cinder block to the bag.
And he went down, and he said when he went off the edge of the road, it was so steep that he went right into the water. And he went out as far as he could. He said he swam out a ways, trying to, and he just let it go. And he come back, and he had a hell of a time getting up the bank up to the car.
If true, and again, this is a huge if, it would mean Joyce's remains were, and still are, at the bottom of Causey. Jared told the investigators Doug had wanted to write to his friends. But remember, Jared had given Doug phony names and addresses. He realized if Doug were to send a letter to one of those addresses, it would bounce back as undeliverable. Doug would discover Jared had lied. So Jared had engineered a workaround. He had told Doug to write the letter, but to let him send it so the envelope would have his name on the return address. That way, the person receiving the letter wouldn't be shocked to get mail from someone on death row. On November 20th of 2006, Doug typed out a 2-page letter to Stephanie, a friend of Jared's girlfriend.
Hi, Stephanie. How are you? I hope I have reached you in good health and spirits. I was happy to hear that it was okay to write you. Jared has mentioned your name in so many of our conversations and speaks highly of you.
Jared handed the typewritten letter to Shane Miner.
Do they have a typewriter down there?
Doug does. He's the only one person in the prison system that has one. They authorized him one.
In the letter, Doug wrote about his life in prison, his tiny cell, his Walkman, his 13-inch color TV, his exercise regimen. He talked about his love of the outdoors, his family, and his new pal.
I've only known Jared for a short time and already consider him an extremely good friend. He's a man with character, morals, and very loyal. Unlike 99% of the people in here.
Perhaps most interesting was Doug's description of his crimes. He acknowledged feeling, quote, deeply ashamed and absolutely horrible for his actions.
However, because of a decision by the Utah Supreme Court last year, it now looks as though my sentence will be overturned in the next 12 to 14 months. I can then work towards parole one day.
Doug did not mention Joyce Yost by name. He didn't explain what he had done to her. He made just that brief, vague admission of some unnamed transgression many years ago.
And I can honestly tell you that what I did does not in any way represent the man I am today.
In the weeks that followed, Shane Miner worked to verify Jared's information. He sent the maps which Doug had reportedly drawn to the crime lab for fingerprint analysis. He had prison staff pull their security tapes and confirmed that through November and early December, Doug and Jared had shared several talks. Some were as long as 2 hours. Meantime, prosecutors from neighboring Colorado traveled to Utah to extradite Jared on another set of criminal charges. On his way out of the Utah State Prison, Jared asked a guard to pass on to the investigators that Doug had asked him to do something. The Colorado case was taken care of, and by the end of February 2007, Jared was back in Utah. Shane met with him again to find out what this ask from Doug was all about. According to Shane's report, Jared said Doug had asked him to find Tom Peters and to do away with him. In exchange, Jared claimed Doug had promised to make him a part owner of his dad's cabin. This, Jared said, had rattled him. To make matters worse, Doug had sent letters directly to Jared's friends and family while he had been away. Some of that mail had bounced back. Jared had been caught in the lie. As the weather began to warm in April of 2007, Shane Miner reached out to the captain of the Utah Department of Public Safety's dive team with a request. Could they take their fancy boat with its sonar up to Causey? Causey was a tough place to launch. There were no concrete ramps, and the reservoir's banks were steep. The big boat was a no-go. Shane next connected with Weber County Sheriff's Lieutenant Jeff Malin, who was at that time head of search and rescue. They had their own dive team. The Weber County divers went into Causey on April 29th, but found its water still too cold to reach bottom in the deeper portions. They were unable to find anything to support Jared Briggs' story of Doug having dumped Joyce's body there. Several months later, over Labor Day weekend, a young man named Jiang Ji attempted to swim across Causey. Jiang was an exchange student from Korea, visiting the reservoir with a group from Washington Heights Baptist Church.
Authorities don't know why the boy went under. He was possibly exhausted, certainly chilled by the cold water. He may have misjudged the distance he was swimming with his church group.
The Weber County dive team mobilized and worked until nightfall without success. They returned the following morning bringing a submersible robot.
The submersible's video camera found the teen 121 feet deep. Its robotic arm grabbed him and brought him to the surface.
This, I've discovered, was not the first time searchers had scoured the lake bed. They had done the same almost 18 years earlier, in September of '89. They too had relied on the help of a submersible.
We have to make sure the umbilicus is...
Weber County Sheriff's deputies and deep-water diving experts from the Provo-based diving company used a remote-control camera to probe the murky depths of the reservoir.
After making the recovery in 2007, the operators of the submersible stuck around to do some extra training. They ran the robot through portions of Causey's north arm. 3 weeks went by before Shane Miner received a call from Jeff Malin about the Labor Day weekend tragedy. Jeff had remembered their earlier conversation about the Jared Briggs tip. He told Shane about the robot and said he had heard it had dredged up a pair of paint cans. Those cans had been full of nails. Maybe they were just some fisherman's makeshift anchors. Or maybe they were a weight of some sort, meant to keep a buoyant object bound to the silty lake bed. I'm not clear if this second-hand information was ever verified. In a report, Shane Miner wrote he didn't know what happened to those paint cans or if the area surrounding where they were discovered was ever searched. Remember, though, that when South Ogden police recovered Joyce's car from where Doug had parked it near the water tank back in August of '85, they had found a bath towel wadded up on the driver's seat, and they had discovered a glass pint jar on the rear passenger side floorboard. The jar had appeared to contain white paint. The Utah Supreme Court heard oral argument in Doug's third appeal on February 3, 2009.
The court is here for oral argument in number 4 on our February calendar, State of Utah versus Douglas Lovell.
That's Chief Justice Christine Durham.
All right, thank you very much. You may proceed for the appellate.
Doug had twice already challenged his conviction at the Utah Supreme Court and lost, as I explained earlier in this episode. This third trip to the High Court took a slightly different approach. It focused on the guilty plea Doug had entered in '93. He had asked to take it back soon afterward, but had been left waiting without an answer for years.
You're going on this expedition of trying to figure out what was in the defendant's mind back then. This case should have been decided 15 years ago.
That's Doug's attorney du jour, David Finlayson. Doug's guilt or innocence wasn't in question by this point in 1999. But if the High Court allowed him to take back the guilty plea, he could have another crack at sentencing and potentially avoid the death penalty. But someone who pleads guilty can't just change their mind after the fact. Doug had to prove to the justices that his original plea had been flawed. His attorney, Finlayson, figured he had found that flaw. He said Judge Stanton Taylor had made several errors when advising Doug of his rights back in '93.
And nowhere in the record of the plea hearing was the presumption of innocence communicated to Mr. Lovell.
This exchange between Doug and Judge Taylor was what's known as a plea colloquy. Rule 11 of the Utah Rules of Criminal Procedure, which I mentioned earlier, spelled out what that colloquy was supposed to include. Under the rule, judges were required to inform defendants making guilty pleas that they were waiving certain rights. Judge Taylor had done that, but using an outdated version of the text.
The presumption of innocence has been found to be a guaranteed right in our Constitution.
The very nature of a colloquy is that it's supposed to be a back and forth, not just a recitation of the text. Judges in '93 expected a certain degree of flexibility with Rule 11. But in the 16 years between Doug's sentencing and this 2009 oral argument, the Utah Supreme Court had clarified judges were supposed to maintain strict compliance. We are talking letter of the law, right down to the precise number of jurors in a capital case like Doug's.
Well, the trial court did advise as to the unanimity required of a jury.
They did?
All the trial court missed was the 12.
Right, the 12 jurors.
To put it simply, Doug was arguing he hadn't known what he was giving up by pleading guilty. Assistant Utah Attorney General Laura Dupay pushed back on that.
He was told 3 times that he was giving up the right to require that the state prove that he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
In the eyes of the state, all Doug had done was find an excuse to try and claw back his plea on a technicality.
That is his complaint now, is that if he had realized that he was going to get a death sentence, this is really about buyer's remorse. And this is exactly the thing or the kind of gamemanship that we should be trying to avoid in the plea process. His reason for pleading guilty was hoping to avoid it. And when he found out that he couldn't avoid it and that he didn't avoid it, that's when he wanted to withdraw from his plea.
Dupay said Doug was an experienced defendant. He had been through sentencing before, both in his armed robbery and rape trials. This, she said, meant Doug had already known his rights.
It's not whether or not the trial court uses specific magic words.
All the years of legal tug-of-war came down to this. Had Doug in '93 fully understood his rights? Had his guilty plea been knowing and voluntary? Had Doug known he was entitled to a presumption of innocence? Had he realized, in order for the jury to sentence him to death, their decision would have had to have been unanimous? Did good cause exist for Doug to withdraw his guilty plea to the murder of Joyce Yost? If the High Court decided the answer was yes, it would mean Doug would get a new trial.
Thank you very much. Thank you, counsel, for your argument this morning. We'll take the case under advisement.
A whole new trial seemed like a long shot, given there was no question as to Doug's guilt. Laura Dupay told Kim Salazar not to worry.
She had told me, there's no way this is going to happen. We've got this thing.
But the justice system took its time.
It's all it's ever done.
More than a year went by. Finally, in July of 2010, the High Court released its decision. Joyce's son, Greg Roberts, was stunned.
My head was spinning. I was like, what?
The justices found in Doug's favor. It was as if the case had hopped into a time machine and traveled back to June of '93, before Doug had admitted to killing Joyce Yost. Laura called Kim to let her know they had lost.
She was so upset and distraught over it that I actually felt sorry for her having to deliver that kind of news.
Judge Lyon had no choice but to sign an order vacating Doug's guilty plea. A plea Doug had originally said was meant to spare Joyce's family any further pain and suffering. For Randy Salazar, it felt like a punch to the gut.
To see him get another chance at starting this thing all over again, it kind of made me feel like, like there's no justice here. This guy keeps on going and getting what he wants when he knows he's already testified. He got up on the stand. He told him exactly what he did. He ruined a lot of people's lives. And here you're giving him another chance. It's just not fair.
17 years had passed since Doug had first landed on death row. 25 years had passed since he had killed Joyce. After all that time, Doug had prevailed. He would get a new trial.
Doug Lovell's got more chances in life than Joyce ever did.
If you or someone you know has endured rape, sexual assault, or sexual abuse of any kind, help is available. In the United States, you can call 1-800-656-HOPE or visit RAINN.org to connect with free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. No one needs suffer in silence. You are not alone. If you haven't already, please subscribe to or follow Cold to make sure you get every episode. You can also interact with me and the Cold team on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Cold Podcast. Cold is researched and written by Dave Cawley, with editorial oversight by executive producer Cheryl Worsley. Additional executive producers include Paul Anderson, Nick Piniella, and Andrew Greenwood. Audio production by Nina Ernest. Mixing by Trent Sell. Michael Bonmiller composed the main score. Special thanks to the team at Amazon Music. Full credits for each episode are available at thecoldpodcast.com. Cold is an Amazon original by KSL Podcasts in association with Workhouse Media. Thank you for listening.